Greetings. I'd like to thank everybody at the University of Alberta who has done the hard work of putting this talk together, including the transition into a virtual event. I would have loved to be with all of you in person. I would have loved to join you face-to-face rather than from my kitchen. But of course, I'm very grateful for the steps that have been taken to keep all of us safe, living as we are in a pandemic whose impacts have been so racially uneven. Today's talk is called Policing Black Lives 5 Years Later, on the limitations of reform and the expansive terrain of abolition. I'll be reflecting first on the conditions that created the publication of Policing Black Lives in the first place, a book that is now 5 years old, but unfortunately remains quite relevant to the conditions facing Black people's lives. Then I will speak briefly to some of the shifts as well as the continuities over these 5 years, asking what has and has not changed since the earlier era of racial reckoning in 2014, 2015. Never one to succumb to pessimism despite the constant rearticulation of the changing same, an enduring practice of what I'm describing as the reorganization of violence in new forms and languages. I will then turn toward liberatory practices of the present and future, turning toward the massive groundswell of historical street-led, Black-led multiracial protests in defense of Black life, Black lives, and racial and economic justice. Thinking in line with an abolitionist politic forwarded much more publicly in 2020, I will forward 10 points, preliminary notes really, to think and keep in mind as we conceptualize what it could be like to build something like liberation in the future, building from the contours of Black political thought, from anti-colonial and transnational Black feminist and past and present abolitionist thought and practice. Now, when I was originally speaking on Policing Black Lives' first publication, I would often quote the words of Montreal-based spoken word artist Shanice Nicole, whose opening line in a poem that she'd written called Deep Sleep is, "I woke up when they put Trayvon to sleep." Of course, this was speaking to a moment now nearly 10 years ago, much more than 5 years ago, in which we really saw the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests, the police killings of Trayvon Martin, of Mike Brown, the uprisings in Ferguson that spread, of course, to rock the United States, to rock Canada, as well as much of the world. We know that the movement in the US was, of course, founded by 3 queer Black women, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, and Alicia Garza. And Canada was rocked by, as well, a massive wave of protests that we should never forget or let be eclipsed by what has happened, of course, the historic protests of 2020, the rise of organizing by Black Lives Matter Toronto, for example, after the police killing of Andrew Loku changed the cultural fabric of Toronto after a 2-week sit-in outside of police headquarters. Black-led protests in Montreal that took to the stage of the International Jazz Festival after the police killings of Pierre Coriolan, a Haitian man who was killed in the context of a mental health crisis in a city that I lived at that time. These were impacting already the cities in which Black people live in this country called Canada in important ways. Catherine Rakitschuk has described Blackness in Canada as always being understood as a surprise. And we can look as well to the revelations of anti-Blackness, much as it is woven into the day-to-day lives of Black people as a surprise each and every time that it occurs. So writing Policing Black Lives at this time was trying to highlight a reality that was not novel, but longstanding, enduring, and endemic. Indeed, I think it's important to remember that prior to 2020, a racial reckoning of some scale has been happening, of course, on a smaller scale, every few years. Each time Black communities, exhausted by the unceasing racial violence at the hands of state institutions, take to the street to vent frustration. The so-called Yonge Street Riot, the Yonge Street Uprising in Toronto of 1992, the protests in Montreal after the killing of Anthony Griffin in 1987, and each time again repeated with surprise, reporters asking researchers, community members, activists over and over again, is this really a problem in Canada? Isn't that an American problem? A PR stunt, which is well over 100 years old. And so I wrote Policing Black Lives in a time of acute racial violence and in a time of massive, historic, Black, queer, feminist, organized resistance in the face of ongoing state violence. tracing the living legacies of slavery and colonial violence that underwrote and underwrite still the making of Canada, tracing the development of these legacies through a multiplicity of state institutions, trace the shifting terrain of a carceral and neoliberal governance of Black people and increasingly poor people of all racial backgrounds' lives, trace the ways in which particular logics, practices, ways of seeing and treating Black peoples, notions that Black people were less sentient, less able to feel pain, more prone to crime, proceeded alongside a continuum, not only in ways of treating or seeing Black people, but indeed built into the very fabric of the institutions that govern life in Canada. Not only put histories of slavery in Canada into conversations with one another to help tell alongside slavery historians the history of slavery in the colonies that would come to be called Canada, but the ways violence against Black life was reorganized under new terms after the abolition of slavery, after the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, after the Multiculturalism Act was passed, the rearticulation and rejustification of Black subjugation through a series of wars on domestic enemies, so frequently raised Black. The war on drugs that facilitated the expansion of the jail and prison system, the war on Jamaican crime that facilitated and justified the punitive turn in the immigration system and led to the mass deportations of Caribbean people in the 1990s, the war on so-called welfare fraud, all of these part of what is in effect a forever war on Black life in this country. The intention was to counter any notion that we could or should be surprised by incidents of anti-Black state violence in a state that has not reckoned with and indeed is the primary perpetrator of violence against Black communities, tracing as well Black people's refusal to accept this any longer. It was crucial at this time to lay out how the surveillance of Black life was institutionalized within multiple state institutions, not only within law enforcement and prisons and jails, but with the so-called helping professions as well. Child welfare, schooling, the way the surveillance and punishment of Black people, including Black children and Black families, often reproduced practices that would lead to the surveillance of Black communities and the punishment of those most vulnerable, made vulnerable Black peoples. And these legacies of Black resistance, of the refusal to remain property under slavery, from runaway enslaved people to vagabonds to the generation we are now living with and in, the sit-ins, the picket lines, the street protests throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. I just say all of this to highlight that policing Black lives was not written into a void, but a moment of protest that preceded, anticipated, and in many ways made possible some of the terms and conditions of which the 2020 so-called reckoning was already underway at this time. By the time of the book's publication, promises of reform, promises of redress had been extended, were being extended by city mayors, by provincial and federal governments who were creating task forces, commissions, inquiries, promising that change was coming, that it was on its way. More studies, small shifts, the problem, we were assured, would be addressed. Now, I don't have time to do a full, of course, extensive legal review of the shifts and the tabled shifts that had been forward since that era, but I will go forward through institutions to take a quick portrait of where we are today in those past 5 years. So, of course, if we ask the question of where are we in the criminal justice system, we know that, for example, in 2008, an Ontario Human Rights Commission report came out finding that Black people were 20 times more likely to be shot by police than white. We had the report published in 2019 by Scott Wortley on Nova Scotia street checks that found that Black people were 6 times more likely to be stopped by police than white. We saw studies released in multiple cities across Canada concurring with that same reality. That's the demand for data was met with data that showed us what Black communities have, of course, been raising for generations. With Bill Blair appointed as the Liberal government's public safety minister, we saw again a commitment in many ways to the changing same. Of course, a former Toronto police chief who actually oversaw the carding that has since now been flagged as a horrendous abuse of Black communities more broadly, that saw a significant portion of Toronto's Black communities stopped, flagged, and put into the system that we now call carding. Of course, we've seen some crucial shifts in the direction of mandatory minimums towards the decriminalization of cannabis, which had so disproportionately impacted Black communities. Nonetheless, we still remain in a condition where, in fact, we are now, over the last 20 years, the police killings have doubled over the past 20 years. And we know that those are impacting Black peoples, Indigenous people, people with mental health issues disproportionately and constantly. So we live in a constant crisis, which of course underpins the fact that we continue to see mass protests at this time. If we look to the immigration system, for example, we saw hunger strikes led by largely Black migrants in 2016 in Ontario. And the response, of course, from the federal government at this time was to bring changes to humanize this system. Ralph Goodall at that time promised $134 million investment in what now we understand was really newly redesigned detention. Yet we're still coming out of a time where in 2018 as well, Ibrahim Toure, a Black migrant, had spent over 5.5 years in detention, not because he, again, had committed any crime, but because CBSA believed, Canada Border Services Agency believed that he would not show up to his deportation. The CBSA agent was in fact since revealed to have acquired a passport by fraudulent means, undercutting what is still the very real reality of indefinite and harmful detention practices in Canada, with an ongoing serious impact on Black communities. In fact, although we saw a kind of commitment to change, in the year 2016 to 2017, 6,268 migrants were detained. In 2017 to 18, 8,355 were held in immigration detention. And in 2018 to 19, we have gone all the way up to 8,781. And so we see that the supposed humanizing of this practice has in fact been the ongoing and increasing caging of our community members. A few days ago, many of my friends and community members attended a protest because a teacher in Toronto, in a Toronto District School Board school, had been wearing blackface in Toronto's West End. While we've seen changes now promised to the Ontario Education Act and some made for the end of streaming, we continue to see that studies have shown in 2017 and 2019, again, since my book originally came out, that Black students are continuing to name that teachers assume they are less intelligent, are experiencing differential treatment based on race, with negative assumptions of their academic abilities being an ongoing issue. A 2017 report by Carl James and Tana Turner found that Black students were twice as likely to be enrolled in applied courses rather than academic, and that only 0.4% of Black high school students were identified as gifted and put into gifted programs. In 2020, Ontario's Education Minister, Stephen Lees, pledged to end the practice of streaming, describing it as systemic, racist, and discriminatory, but Black community organizers, advocates, parents, and teachers have continued to highlight that much more work, in fact, needs to be done, especially through French immersion and specialized programs. Though we often have seen the calls for more representation of Black life in schools, it's important to highlight that representation, when available, has often been offensive, including a 2020 case in which an 11-year-old Black girl in a Montreal school was sent home with homework that contained the N-word in it. An Appeal District School Board study, again published in 2020, found that in the previous year, Black high school students, who made up 10% of the school population, made up almost 1/4 of suspensions. And of course, we've uncovered in recent years the presence of police in schools being much more understood as much more widely than many Canadians had believed, including in Alberta and across many Canadian provinces. The ongoing racism and anti-Black racism in the child welfare program, of course, was really brought to the forefront due to the organizing of Fatima Abdi over the deportation, the near deportation of former child refugee Abdul Abdi, a Somali young person who was put in child welfare in Nova Scotia, who over the course of 31 foster homes and group homes, no one had applied for his citizenship and faced deportation, a near deportation in 2018 after being criminalized. So we continue to see that, perhaps not as a surprise for those of us who've been studying this for a long time, but nonetheless shocking in the ongoing harms that it reveals, that we should not be surprised that 2020 erupted as it did. Historic protests across Canadian cities were not only about solidarity with Black people being killed in the United States, though of course this is always a part of it, as there are always transnational contours of solidarity in any freedom struggle, but also very much in defense of Black lives here. A refusal to accept the status quo, a refusal to accept the normalization of violence experienced by Black communities was in many ways underwriting the protests of this time. Of course, the pandemic revealed most acutely the violent exclusions upon which our society relies, demonstrating that the highly vulnerable and underpaid and often lacking full citizenship people deemed essential workers work in largely brutal working conditions. Laborers whose unemployment conditions have been steadily defunded over the past several decades were again brought into the public sphere as we saw the conditions of Caribbean agricultural workers, of Mexican agricultural workers, of people working in industrial production assembly lines, asked to pay the highest price while being deemed essential, most vulnerable to death in a pandemic that unfolded and is still unfolding on racially uneven lines. The pandemic, in fact, showed us who is being revealed to be first to die in what Dion Brand has termed a racial calculus set in place long ago. It exposed the fault lines of racial violence that were always already there in a society already stratified by race, citizenship, class, sexuality, gender, and ability. So in this explosion of the major protest movement of tens of thousands in the streets of Toronto protesting the police killing of a Black Indigenous woman, Regis Korshinsky-Paquet, massive protests in Winnipeg, Halifax, Edmonton, the largest protest movement of a generation is coming not only in the wake of recent incidents, but is something that is a response to a long-standing, long institutionalized form of devaluing Black people's lives. We saw protesters and young people in the street who saw how little had been done since Trayvon, since Andrew Loku, since Ferguson. After the supposedly post-racial era of Obama, of course, we saw the election of the most openly white supremacist state leader in many decades in the United States. Interestingly enough, in the introduction to my book, which was published in 2017 but finished in 2016, wrote that the outward explicit expressions of racist thought were no longer as publicly acceptable, though I said this appears to be shifting, when of course we saw this shift very significantly with the return in 2016 to older and more explicit forms of racial violence, of open derision and hostility to Black communities, to Muslim communities, an open and violent hostility towards migrants. And yet, it's important not to mark that particular moment as particularly exceptional. The story of Black unfreedom in North America and globally is one that is marked by continuities across conservative and liberal spectrums. And this is true not only in the last 5 years, but consistently true. I traced in Policing Black Lives how while conservatives often forwarded the most carceral policies, the prison system and the laws that made it possible expanded under both liberal as well as conservative leadership. The mid-90s immigration legislation shifts that expanded the groups of migrants who could be prosecuted and then deported for criminal offenses took place under the liberal government. In the United States, we need to remember and keep this historical memory that the first Black Lives Matter movement came out under a Black president who espoused commitment to racial equality, yet oversaw the largest numbers of deportations in US history, making him what social justice organizers termed deporter-in-chief. So this is to highlight the carceral continuities over these past 5 years, but also much longer. So for example, in contrast to a president that had referred to Haitians and Africans as, for example, having AIDS, needing to go back to their huts, in the context of a more humane Biden, nonetheless, images have surfaced that we've all seen now in the past months of the US Border Patrol on horseback, trying to stop Haitian migrants from entering an encampment on the banks of the Rio Grande in Del Rio, Texas. Canada, in the second term of a liberal government, is now outwardly claiming adherence to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to ending anti-Black racism while fighting families of Indigenous children in court, over Indigenous children stolen by the child welfare system, which Cindy Blackstock has so clearly described as the new residential schools in Canada, along with jails. All this to say that conservative and liberal governments, Democratic and Republican governments have continued to retrench a system leading to Black people's inability to breathe, inability to live. Some doing it faster and more efficiently and more ruthlessly, but nonetheless, none creating the conditions that could be, to paraphrase Harriet Jacobs, akin to Black freedom. A lack of imagination has led to the ongoing consensus that policing and cages are the way to manage the ever-rising racial, economic, and gendered inequalities of our time. And this is across the two supposed options that we are continually offered as governance. The notion that we can police problems and the people who represent them, that we can cage and disappear people rather than the ongoing issues that make some people cageable and disposable. I highlight these continuities not to cause any kind of depression or pessimism, but to highlight the need for more radical transformation. We saw at this time, Black-led, working class, poor, and middle class people as well taking to the streets, asking not only for justice in an abstract way, but we also witnessed a tightening of demands. Others, as well as myself, have often remarked how in 2014, 2015, for example, one of the chants you heard on the street was, the whole damn system is guilty as hell. Indict, convict, send those killer cops to jail. And while what that does is push, of course, for the use of the criminal justice system as a response to the harms of the criminal justice system, the political terrain has shifted. Calls for justice have become more precise, with increasing recognition in the streets and community centers, as well as in the academy, that justice is not possible from a system designed to surveil, police, and confine Black and Indigenous peoples to secure the theft of Indigenous land and ongoing control over Black communities. A recognition that policing and prison, though called public safety, are not safety, but its opposite. We saw a call from across the cities of this country, across Canada and the United States, that to really reduce violence, to meaningfully end violence against Black communities, against Indigenous communities, to meaningfully end state violence, in fact, demands a need to reduce toward eliminating the violence of policing as governance, a shift toward a more collective safety. What this demonstrates is that in many ways, some of the most transformative demands, of course, are coming from the grassroots and from social movements. In this unprecedented wave of protest and organizing, for example, in March 2020 to March 2021, there were more than 21 hunger strikes from across Canadian carceral sites. What we saw was not the demand only for the liberation of some people who were incarcerated, but a demand to free them all was the main demand, to highlight the fact that, in fact, even in a pre-pandemic, jails and prisons were already a public health crisis for those that they incarcerated and for society more broadly. That if people had been and were released in the context of a pandemic, that perhaps that nobody should have been incarcerated in the first place, rejecting a politics of disposability. We saw the demand as well coming from immigration detention centers, again, not only for the release of a few people in detention, but for status for all, an end to the stratification of human life that allows some people to be subject to expendability within labor practices, as well as to be locked within cages. Canada's dependence on underpaid, highly exploited labor was quite revealed, as the Haitian and other largely Black migrants working on the front lines of healthcare and janitorial work transformed from being the embodiment of the so-called migrant crisis during the election of Legault a few years ago to being now the ange gardien, the guardian angels, and yet countered with the notion, nous sommes toutes essentielles, we are all essential, arguing that, of course, frontline workers and those deemed essential in the context of a pandemic should have status, but that there are many, many people in this society who are essential, that everybody working and living here, everybody living here is essential, and refusing to cap that idea of essential workers in such a small manner. In education, we've seen Black parents and community members and students on the front lines to address and counter what I called in Policing Black Lives, the miseducation of Black youth, often at great personal cost. In the fall of 2020, we saw several hundred Black students walking out of schools in Calgary, protesting multiple incidents of teachers using the N-word while talking to students. Some decried the general erasure of Black history from their schools. Many walked from their school to Calgary Police Headquarters chanting Black Lives Matter. In Dartmouth Prince Andrew High School, dozens of students staged a Black Minds Matter walkout in November 2020 to highlight endemic racism from fellow students and demanded an expanded commitment on Black culture and history in their schools. That same fall, another walkout organized in Hamilton by students, organized in York by Students Speak Up YCDSB, saw students demand more hiring of Black teachers, mandatory anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism training, and a mechanism allowing them to report racism at York's Catholic School Board. Black students, Black parents, and other racialized community members have also been on the forefront of a now North America-wide movement for police-free schools, particularly led by Latin, Toronto, but much more broadly. While studies have continued to highlight how the presence of law enforcement in schools has been disastrous for Black and racialized youth, police and school programs have now begun to be terminated en masse in a way that could not possibly have been foreseen in 2016. In Toronto Freedom School, Black Lives Matter Toronto, and Latinx, Afro-Latin America, Abba Yala Education Network, Latin, and Education Not Incarceration led a successful struggle to remove SROs, student resource officers, from the country's largest school board. And this win was only the first of its kind, that in 2017, because particularly in the wake of the historic Black-led struggles after the police killing of George Floyd in 2020, we saw increasingly massive shifts across this country that again are changing the fabrics of what education could mean for Black children and for Black young people. After a Black ESL student was dragged out of a Hamilton area school in handcuffs, high school students in Hamilton, Students for Justice, staged an 8-hour sit-in and an ongoing campaign to terminate the Police in Schools program. They were victorious with the school board vote in their favor in 2020. A successful Cops Out of Our Schools campaign led by Asilu Collective at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, again led to a successful vote to end SRO programs. In the Peel region, after a powerful campaign led by parents of Black children, led by Black mothers Claudette Rutherford, Carrie Daniels, and Charlene Grant, again, we saw a move toward the end of the practice of police presence in Black young people's schools. Now, these are only a few examples. Indeed, Toronto's legacy has in fact been successfully recreated across national borders. In the United States, 25 cities have canceled contracts with police departments and removed SROs from schools in a study by Andrea Ritchie. So in sum, we can see the intellectual and the political labor displayed in the form of Black and Black-led protest has changed the political terrain substantively. If the institutional response has often been muted, the presence of law enforcement officers in places ostensibly geared toward learning is becoming increasingly morally indefensible. And if the broader police-free schools movement is successful, the very notion that schools once intentionally hosted armed and violent agents of the state could be relegated to an embarrassing and shameful chapter in history. Now, of course, there's much work to be done toward this regard. But I say all of this just to highlight that even in the face of very few and very tepid proposals, often coming from institutions themselves, what we have seen is that even if the media, for example, turned away after the first wave of protests in defense of Black life that we saw in 2014, that people have been working steadily to create alternatives, steadily to create other ways of living, other ways of governing, other ways of educating that help not only Black people in this country and in this continent, but the larger population more broadly. Now, of course, we did see a spectacle of reception. If we look to, for example, Nancy Pelosi kneeling in the kente cloth, Justin Trudeau and Mark Saunders, former Toronto police chief, taking a knee, we can, of course, take stock of the many apologies and the many promises. So, for example, Justin Trudeau also endorsed, but importantly did not commit to implementing 44 recommendations of a call to action from the Parliamentary Black Caucus. But in fact, if we look even after the demands of 2020, after the historic wave of protests, what we do see again is more money invested in reform, which is what Dylan Rodriguez has called certain kinds of liberal reforms as counterinsurgencies, right? As reforms that offer us instead ways of retrenching and reinforcing the legitimacy of harms while tinkering perhaps with their delivery. So, and one example, although what was being demanded across Canadian cities was the call to defund police by 50% and more. We saw this in cities spanning Toronto to Vancouver, much more broadly, right? To divest this money that goes into policing as a solution for community safety, for issues like mental health crises, for issues like gender-based violence, and instead to actually invest in real community solutions. But instead, what we saw particularly was, for example, Justin Trudeau announcing in June of 2020 a plan to invest more money into body cams as part of addressing systemic racism. We saw, of course, also the Toronto Police Services planning to see the force purchase 2,350 body-worn cameras to the cost of $34 million over 5 years. Part of what Interim Chief James Raymer said would modernize policing services. But of course, what was being demanded was not cameras filming people who would continue to be harmed, as studies have shown us is what takes place. Studies continue to show that body harms do not prevent police violence, but instead we saw more money being poured into a harm, the modernizing of a kind of harm, when what was actually being asked and demanded was its abolition. Communities at this time across this country and around the world are demanding more than another reorganization of violence and the terms and practices of violence. So what I wanted to forward before parting with you was 10 points, which are of course 10 preliminary ways of mapping out from the contours of Black political thought, ways that allow us to think expansively toward what Black freedom could look like. This was inspired by looking towards different traditions of freedom making spanning Black anti-colonial struggle, Indigenous struggle, transnational Black feminisms, and abolitionist movements as well, thinking about some of the roadmaps towards reordering society and creating more liberatory futures for all. And of course, this is not exhaustive, and we always continue to build and rebuild and rebuild. So the first point that I wanted to forward is that formal equality will not save us. As I'd mentioned earlier, every shifting unfreedom in recent years has often been a reorganizing violence under new terms. In a period where we are confronted with declarations of inclusion, of celebrating diversity, we need to remember that if this is only on the surface or at the formal level, we are unlikely to see substantive change. If we look to, for example, the fact that slavery was abolished in Canada in 1834, slavery was abolished in 1865 in the United States, but of course, racial violence was not. Nor was racial violence abolished with Brown versus Board of Education in the United States with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Nor was it, again, abolished, was the organization of mass violence ended with the passage of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or the Multicultural Act in Canada. In fact, again, as I'd highlighted, police killings have doubled over the past 20 years. The different ways of excluding Black people from the polity, from the very category of who is a citizen, continue regardless of the formal shifts in law. So if we look to the work of Saidiya Hartman, for example, or the work of Adam Getachew, to take a global perspective, we can see how the burdened equality of entering into a system of formal equality, right? In which, for example, Black peoples in the United States were able to be recognized, but only as criminal, or as Adam Getachew has argued, nominally decolonized nations finally entered a global space of nation states, formerly free but bound by Western states to remain in economic dependence and political subservience. The supposedly free Black world and the internal colonies of the US and Canada and the now decolonized nations have not yet achieved freedom, because every unfreedom at this time has wrought new forms of unfreedom. reorganizing violence under new names. The end of slavery in the Caribbean, of course, was then followed by decades and decades of US and European colonialism. Haiti's freedom in particular continually undermined by Western states, first by the France's emancipation debt, as well as, of course, by the US occupation. All of this obscured now in the sometimes pitying words in the media, the ahistorical representation of Haiti as the poorest nation in the hemisphere, a legacy of colonial violence nowhere to be found when discussing the migrant crisis, for example, of Haitians arriving into Canada at Roxton Road, or being subject to violence by the Border Patrol under the banks of the Rio Grande. Colonialism, as Ama Ata Edu has famously written, has not been posted anywhere, regardless of the names. Neither has carceral colonial racial capitalism. So equality in a system designed on racial hierarchies, violently enforced by the carceral state, is often no such thing. And really, what is citizenship when Black people continue to be dying at the hands of police, lives shortened by prisons, families destroyed by the welfare system? Formal freedom is nothing of the sort that we could call freedom when these kinds of violences persist and when vast economic inequality prevails. And yet new forms of governance are on the horizon. I wanted to highlight as well a second point, and I'll move more quickly because I'm realizing that perhaps I'm coming to the close of my time, but I wanted to highlight in a similar vein that representation is not the same thing as liberation, pointing out, for example, that the massive organizing in Black communities around the deportation of Abdul Abdi was happening at the same time as Canada had a Black immigration minister, Ahmed Hassan, that the head of police in the city where George Floyd was killed had already had a queer Indigenous head of police, a Black head of police, had already been trained in anti-racism training, right? So that these sorts of representations, these sort of representational figureheads are not what is offering us liberations. When death-making institutions remain intact and geared toward their primary purpose, then of course meaningful change is impossible. When Black feminists counter that until Black women are free, none of us are free, as was part of the Combahee River Collective, what they were not arguing was a Black woman at the head of the helm of a war machine, but arguing for an end of the war on Black folks everywhere, taking into account especially the lives of poor Black women, queer Black women. I want to forward number 4, of course, that we consistently learn from our past, even when our past is erased, that if Blackness is always held up as a surprise, Black histories nonetheless are something that continue to provide us with new and other kinds of way forwards. I'm always reminding my students, for example, showing them archives like the feminist digital archives that show us newspapers by the Black Women's Collective, who put out Our Lives, Canada's first Black women's newspaper, to remind everyone that we have been here before, that many of the issues that we've been confronting for a long time are issues that have a long history, and that we are part of a long legacy of people seeking freedom that have come well before us as well. The 5th point that I wanted to make is that there is no Black liberation without decolonization, that the liberation of Black peoples is sutured to the destinies of Indigenous peoples on these lands that we now all collectively call home. So if we think about the land back movement that is happening right now, if we think about the struggles in 1492 land back lane of Wet'suwet'en, in which Indigenous peoples are still being arrested and violently displaced from their land, that there could be no racial justice in this country without meaningfully addressing the very real demand for land back that we are seeing across these lands at these times. Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson remind us not to vie for settler-adjacent equality in a settler state, but to think about instead the undoing of those logics and thinking about liberation much more extensively and centering land back as a part of that. The 6th point that I wanted to make is that Black struggle is anti-colonial struggle, is anti-imperial struggle. M. Jackie Alexander, along with many other transnational Caribbean feminists, draw our attention to the fact that nothing that happens here is unrelated to a series of global elsewheres. So if we look, for example, to thinking about what it means to end the brutal practice of the policing and harm and incarceration of Black peoples in this country, we also need to look to what is Canada's role in the global conditions of Black peoples, whether that's Canada's role in the coup d'etat in Haiti, Canada's role in selling arms to Yemen, the fact that our retirement funds are often, in fact, funded by many mining operations abroad, for example, that are displacing Black and Indigenous peoples from their homelands. Black struggle is anti-colonial struggle, is anti-imperial struggle. The seventh point that I wanted to highlight is Black struggle, is queer struggle, is trans struggle. I'm thinking very much with the case and the ongoing realities of Mocha Dawkins, a Black trans woman who was criminalized and spent 4 years incarcerated at Toronto South and Toronto East Detention Center for self-defense, time served in a male prison because she didn't want to be put in segregation for the entirety of her incarceration, who endured many transphobic attacks, including violent words from the guards So what this really highlights, I think, is the crucial reality that if we're not centering the realities of Black trans women, of sex working women, of people who are, again, pushed to the very outskirts, even within Black community, then our struggle will not be liberatory for all. And we're in a really powerful time with the leadership of queer Black feminisms, trans Black feminisms that are charting new territories and that show us the intricacies from which change is required. The eighth point that I'd wanted to make is that Black struggle is green struggle, that destruction of earthly life is part of the longer genocidal logics of chattel slavery and settler colonialism, that addressing Black people's freedom in the context of a collapsing climate, of course, relies on us to remember that many of the harms of the ongoing crisis are impacting people in Africa and the Caribbean, as well as the broader global South, so extensively that there is no way of thinking about freedom here that is not as well thinking about the earth. From the Garifuna land defenders to people in Black Nova Scotia who've been fighting on the front lines against environmental racism. Now, the ninth point that I'd wanted to make is that, really building from what I'd said earlier, that abolition is the future, that what is being asked for in terms of life-saving remedies is not to modernize policing or prisons, not more diverse officers or trainings, but really an end to all forms of surveillance, police, and policing. I wrote in 2017, the fact that radical change may be necessary to achieve racial and economic injustice should not deter us from believing that we can and should work toward a society that deprioritizes, disinvests, and dismantles institutions that mandate the violent subordination of our most vulnerable. The moves that we're seeing, the demands that we're seeing broadly supported in many communities to move funding and power and legitimacy away from policing is a challenge to carceral governance more broadly, a demand to end the criminalization of homelessness, of drug use, of sex work, of Black and Indigenous life more broadly, and to instead redress harms is one that powerfully challenges the way that our society is organized and demands us to rethink and reorganize, again, to create a society in which we do not dispose of people and then police and incarcerate or deport them for being disposed of. And the last and 10th point that I wanted to make, inspired by Ruth Wilson Gilmore's assertion that abolition is a presence, is that abolition is building, that we already have on the ground so many ideas for what a just society could look like. We saw already during the pandemic that it was always already possible to let people come home from jail, from detention centers. It was only a matter of priorities. When it became a public health concern, this was possible. So we already saw, we've seen so many possibilities already that we were already told was impossible in this time. I continue to ask my students regularly, what else? What would it mean to not only take away harmful institutions, but to actually work to end harm, to meaningfully work to end violence? We know that Black, Indigenous, and racialized survivors of gendered violence, queer and trans and cis and gender nonconforming survivors have been on the forefront of developing alternative means of safety, transformative and restorative forms of justice. Even the Roots of Youth Violence report that came out in Ontario in the 1990s after the so-called Summer of the Gun was hardly an abolitionist document, but nonetheless, it did not forward more policing as a solution to violence, but more community centers, more funding for community programming. In the the broader struggle that we are a part of for breathable air, for livable housing, for secure communities is absolutely what it means to reimagine what liberated futures could look like. It's a matter of when and not if. In the last 5 years, the uprisings of 2020 did not bring a mass institutional changes, but it did show an entire generation ready to dream up possibilities of a new society, of a new local and international society that's premised on life and living and care, rather than death, extraction, and violently enforced hierarchies. We saw new life breathed into an unwillingness to accept what had previously been spoon-fed to us as the only way to accept society. So at the precipice of crises, of police killings, of continual crises, of neoliberal economy, of a global pandemic and ecological disaster, it's helpful, I think, to keep with the words of the late, great Walter Rodney, who told us another world is necessary. And I would remind us in thinking with this that some communities have been building other worlds the whole time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for such an instructive and engaging lecture, Robyn. I think one of the things I really appreciated, which is also something that you do in Policing Black Lives, is I think the level of care and attention that you provide in articulating Black life in Canada, as well as how you cite and synthesize the works of other Black Canadian scholars and sort of put them in conversation with each other. And yeah, I really appreciate that. Dr. Rogers has already introduced me, but I'll just quickly say my name is Prof. Collins Ifonu, and I'll be moderating the Q&A segment of this lecture. I'd like to invite you to send your questions to Robyn through Menti using the code displayed at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, I'll jump right into the questions. Now, Robyn, one of the themes that you cover in your lecture is the limits of reform. And thinking towards the future, and particularly on point number 9, which is sort of thinking about abolition as the future, I'm wondering if you can shed more light on what sort of an alternative modes of governance are out there that we in Canada or North America more generally can emulate.
Thank you so much for that question and for your kind words as well about the work. I've been thinking a lot about this essay that I think all of us maybe collectively read, written by Dion Brand at the start of the pandemic about the desire not to return to normal. And one of the words that she uses to describe what was normal, what is normal, what is the violent normality of everyday life is about policing as governance. Right? So about forwarding policing and the kind of neoliberal carceral models of governance that we have in this era. Of course, as we've seen the massive expansion of this kind of carceral governance, and something that I've been thinking a lot and continue to ask myself in writing as well is what is the opposite of a carceral society? And I think that we can really reformulate the opposite of a carceral society as a care-based society. So if the role of the carceral state is in retrenching racial and economic inequalities that are required by capitalism. Bruce Wilton Gilmore famously says, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. But we can add, of course, to that the carceral retrenches it. So what we can do is really to think about what it would mean and how to take seriously the kinds of alternative governance formations that are actually happening all the time right now. So I was a part of, with many Indigenous penal abolitionists and freelance free peoples, as well as people organizing against policing and against prisons and against migrant detention across Canada, and creating what was called a choosing real safety way of thinking about what it would mean to think about more livable life in Canada. And it was organized around the 3-pronged structure called defund, dismantle, build. And I think what it does is actually describes some really crucial ways that we can think about what it means to defund and dismantle carceral modes of government. So of course, to stop investing public and private money into policing and prison infrastructure, to stop increasing budgets to hire more police and officers, to stop building new police stations and headquarters and jails and prisons and immigration detention centers, and commit to actually dramatically funding municipal, provincial, and federal funding for carceral infrastructures. Thinking too about dismantling, right? Dismantling the use of policing and prisons with the goal of ending punitive injustice within a generation, removing police from positions within social services, including schools, mental health responses, disarmament. And I won't go into all of these, but I think what I do want to highlight is some of what it means to invest. Because if we want to think about alternative modes of governance, we need to remember, of course, that what it means to think about governance based in care in safety is to actually invest again and radically reorganize economies such that money that is currently bloating police and prison budgets could actually be used toward building safety for people who are currently most impacted by surveillance and policing. So of course, Black, Indigenous, unhoused, migrant people, people who use drugs, people living with disabilities, investing in long-term and free, affordable housing, access to healthy food, to clean water, to community gardens, investing in addressing the root causes of harm in our society, thinking about community-based, non-carceral mental health care, community-based resources, and public safety approach, thinking about care and wellness and healing in ways that move toward non-coercive mental health care and wellness resources, supports for drug and alcohol treatment for people who would want them. Again, thinking about, of course, land back, right, as being a crucial segment of this, of allowing the rebuilding of something that at this very moment, of course, in Wet'suwet'en, people are being arrested and for merely defending their own land. So to honor existing treaties, to honor Indigenous sovereignty, and to again, invest in redevelopment for decommissioned police and prisons under the guidance of Indigenous nations on whose lands the buildings sit. Thinking about reparations models for people who've been harmed by state violence. These are only a few ways. I think that what's really exciting about this question of what else, if not this, and this is something I spoke to earlier, is that there's so many models. Mariame Kaba often reminds us that thinking about abolitionist futures is not thinking about somewhere else for the people that we've deemed disposable to go or someone else to police them, but actually thinking about reorganizing society such that people are not disposed of, and thinking about alternative ways of managing and preventing harm that are non-carceral. So I think that these are actually, if we think about this theoretically, these are actually modes of governance that are existing right now that continue to be sidestepped, pushed aside, and devalued, defunded, and disinvested, when these are actually futures, that are being sprouted in this time, that are actually always available and around us, if only we would care to look.
Right. Thank you, Robyn. I'm just going to move on to the next question. We've got quite a few to get through, as I'm sure you can imagine. We've got a question here that says, I'm Black and relatively new in Canada. I would like to know if racial profiling is legalized in Canada. A friend asked me if there's a way to verify if he is being profiled by police in Alberta.
So this is something that is a provincial matter. So of course, the practice of carding, for example, in Ontario was explicitly practiced for a long time and has since technically been outlawed. But I think what's important to remember as well is that legal or no, the police profiling of people is happening. So there are certain kinds of practices of things like carding, of asking for identification and putting people in gang databases that have varying levels of legality depending on which province you're in. However, given the ways that we live in a society that criminalizes poverty-related offenses, including so-called loitering, that gives police, again, deputize the power to stop and surveil and to harm and even kill people without threat of retribution from any legal perspective, then of course, regardless of the formalities of the law, we live in a society where where police power is nearly absolute, right? If you are Black, that you can be subjected to innumerable kinds of harms. And we unfortunately see this over and over and over again. So what we have is something, that I described in Policing Black Lives as state-sanctioned violence, in that it continues to be sanctioned as an ongoing practice, regardless of whether or not it's formally or informally allowed. Because of course, murder is illegal in Canada, but if you're killed by a police officer, then suddenly that's no longer murder, right? So what we have is a situation of institutional violence that's legitimized and legitimated by the institution itself.
Right. Okay, we've got another question that says, thank you, Robyn. I'm grateful to you. As an Indigenous RN, I am interested in your thoughts on structural racism inherent in our healthcare systems and carceral logics in mental health.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to think about. And there's been a lot of really important work, particularly coming out of the United States, asking us to think very carefully when we talk about thinking about alternatives, for example, there's been a strong push, of course, since, multiple police killings of Black and Indigenous people in the context of mental health crises in Canada. So spurring, of course, a push to say that police should not be, of course, the first line responders in a mental health situation. But what, people who are doing this kind of community-based work on the ground, especially in the United States, through groups like Interrupting Criminalization, are reminding us not to just forward mental health care as if it was inherently a non-carceral response, reminding us of the ways that forced psychiatrization can also be a kind of a carceral contour. So it's sort of asking us to think imaginatively and to make our demands with precision, I suppose, when we're thinking about what it would mean to really ask for and work to implement non-carceral mental health practices, realizing that that's not necessarily, in many cases, what we actually have right now. So I think that question is really powerful and points out something really crucial, which is that at this time, a lot of the things that we think about as alternatives, so for example, social work, mental health supports, are often nonetheless actually working in collaboration with or in a sort of similar style as carceral practices. So what does it mean to actually rethink those kinds of institutions, and particularly remove the role of police and policing and police collaboration from those spaces, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's, at least those are some building blocks of how we can start to think our way out of this, and how we can remember that, again, not trying to create that somewhere else where people go and are forced to stay, right? But thinking about what it would mean to actually help people build livable lives with the kinds of adequate supports that are non-punitive and non-surveillance based. And I think these are some of the really crucial questions of our times, right? Is about actually harnessing political imagination to think about and dream about and work to manifest and implement alternatives.
Okay, our next question says, is there a place for Black police officers, even as a temporary method towards change?
I think that that's something that we can just look toward history in order to help ourselves answer, because there has been a strong movement, particularly in the United States, but in Canada as well, that we were sold as a reform, many decades ago, the idea that having perhaps more diverse police officers, more Black or Indigenous police officers, would somehow make policing less violent. And I think that what we really need to remember is that policing itself is a kind of violence, regardless of who is at the helm, right? So one of the things I was trying to speak to in my points was the ways in which representation does not offer meaningful liberation. And I think that's especially the case if we look to the institution of policing, where of course we had Mark Saunders at the helm, of policing during some of the most major protests against policing across this city, right? During a time of intense police violence towards Black communities, around the time that Regis Korsinski-Paquet was killed. We have a Black head of police in Ottawa. So we continue to have situations where Black people are being killed and killed with impunity, regardless of the color of the skin of the person who is at the helm. And that's because, again, if we look to the role of policing in our society and its role in retrenching racial and economic injustice, then we need to realize that regardless of how you look at the front of that, the institution will do what the institution will do. So I think that it's really important to highlight that because there are measures that are being forwarded as reforms that we're being asked to consent to in a time of great political unrest around policing, like things like body cams, things like diversity trainings, things like Black police officers, we need to ask ourselves, is this reducing the power, the budget, and the legitimacy of policing? Because those are the kinds of reforms that you can consider non-reformist reforms, right? That actually reduce and minimize the harms of police and policing as a whole, as opposed to something, like investing in more Black officers, which is actually increasing in funding, increasing in, again, the public and moral legitimacy of an institution, rather than chipping away at it. So that's a really helpful way for us to think about what is and is not going to help work as a reform on the way toward justice or on the way towards more of the changing same.
Okay, now our next question picks up on one of the points you raised about the link between Black and Indigenous liberation. And it says, how can Black people in Canada, the majority of us being victims of colonization in our home countries, support Indigenous people's struggle for sovereignty and self-determination?
I mean, currently at this time, there is a call for support across these lines in terms of the RCMP violence in Wet'suwet'en, right? So I think that right now we're actually at a really powerful moment when the call is explicitly do a solidarity action, organize, right? So there are times when if we are able, it's one thing to proclaim your solidarity, which I think one can and should do in day-to-day life, but there are times in which we're actually asked to show what that, looks like with our bodies, with our organizing. And I think that those are really crucial ways to be in support of these movements, remembering that, of course, Black liberation and Indigenous liberation are entangled with one another, are, of course, mutually constituting liberation projects, right? So there is no Black liberation on stolen lands without supporting land back, without really, grounding that liberation in Indigenous decolonization. And I think that the more that we're really able to remember that and to remember the intertwined nature of our liberatory movements, the more we're going to be able to advance something that is actually a more liberatory terrain more broadly.
Okay, our next question says, when you spoke of the issue of representation of Black history and culture within schools, do you feel that this issue is improving and more representation is being considered in the curriculum?
That's something that I'm still looking into at this time. There are incredible, of course, Black people, like Natasha Henry, for example, who's been doing powerful work in Ontario to change these curriculums. But I think we still are in a situation where students are learning very little or very nil about the realities of Black folks in Canada, especially outside of Black History Month. So I think this is beginning to change. I can see this beginning to change at the university level. So for example, when Policing Black Lives first came out, when I would ask rooms of people, had you learned about slavery at any point in your education, and almost nobody would raise their hand, right? So I think we're beginning to see some edging out of that, but at the same time, it's very, very little, and we haven't seen actually formal institutional changes, the kinds of formal institutional changes that would be required to make learning about, Black history, histories of anti-Blackness in this country possible in a substantive way. I couldn't speak to the details of Alberta, for example, about that in terms of those changes specifically, so I don't want to speak beyond my knowledge cone, but.
Okay. So our next question here is, how can individuals who are not working in the criminal justice system contribute to tangible change? What are the next steps for those who want to move into action?
Well, one thing that I think is this for people who are not working in the criminal justice system?
Yes.
To make sure I understand the question. Thank you for that. So I think that particularly now we're in a time, again, I've been, trying to highlight in some ways all of the different points in which the struggle, the struggles of our times are really asking us to show up in many of the different places where our skills are. So as I'd highlighted, there are movements across this country, for example, to remove police and policing from schools. Now, if you are a parent, that's of course a really valuable place to jump in if you're concerned about, having a school in which there are armed police officers and you're concerned about the safety of Black students and racialized students there, then that's a struggle that as a parent is a part of your life that you can take a part in. I think it's really crucial for us to always stay close to home when we can. I don't mean to forego transnational supports, but what I do mean, I guess, is to at least start with something that that touches your life, because there's no part of any of our lives and our communities that doesn't in some way come up against the harms of the carceral state, right? So whether that's, for example, joining unions and working again to have unions, move away from supporting, for example, the inclusion of police presence in unions, that is another level of struggle. Or if you're somebody that lives in a neighborhood near where agricultural work is being done to support the kind of struggles that migrant agricultural workers are undertaking right now to regularize status and to work against, an apartheid citizenship regime that is part of the functioning of this country. So if you eat strawberries, then that's something that touches your life as well, right? Given that strawberries are picked by, largely people from the Caribbean and from Mexico. So I guess if you just look around your home, if you think about every part of your life, you will not be able to find a life that is untouched by human suffering and organized violence. And that also provides an infinite amount of ways to actually become involved to either start an organization, join an organization. I think that in a time, again, of multiple crises at the same time, there's really no limit to ways of plugging in. And I think it's about just remembering that and finding up ways to dive in and doing so.
All right, so our next question here says, hi, Robyn. My name's also Robyn, and it's been so lovely to hear from you. Can you speak about the role of youth in pushing for systemic change and insights you'd offer to young organizers?
Sure. I would say that some of the most exciting and powerful organizing that I'd seen, for example, this year was the organizing of Hamilton Students for Justice over this past year, who, for example, again, organized for the successful removal of police from their school, organized for, like a sit-in outside of, again, they were part of organizing that organized a sit-in outside of City Hall, for example. So I just think that a lot of that was teenagers and students, right? That was actually done at students. So some of the organizing, of course, that happened around SROs in Toronto was done by concerned parents and teachers. But here we actually have a place in which students, concerned with what was happening to students in their school, said no and organized against this. And I'd also brought up, earlier in the talk, some of the really powerful examples of Alberta-based Black students, right, mobilizing for change and for Black liberation to mean something from an education perspective. So I think that it's a really, again, to just sort of become involved in whatever part of your life that looks like, I think is something that's always possible. I don't think that we should always, there's this way of totally romanticizing youth in a way that puts all the pressure on only youth to solve all the problems. And I do think we need to see a multi-generational responsibility, of course, for addressing some of the crucial injustices of our time. But I do think that, especially when you're young, I think you have maybe some of the most creative solutions, and your imagination is perhaps the least stunted in terms of what else could be, and the less jaded in terms of injustice. So I think that's a really valuable time to realize that things don't need to be as they are, and that making change is possible and necessary.
Okay, right, we're moving on to the next question. Next one here says, how can Black Albertans navigate code switching in white environments? So you can maybe substitute Albertans for Black Canadians. As a Black person working in law enforcement, I struggle to express myself naturally, which makes me uncomfortable.
Well, I mean, to answer that in a more broad way, I think that we all just make different choices about, how we feel comfortable in the places that we're navigating. I don't know that I have a cure-all for that, one, but I would say that, given if you're a Black person in law enforcement, giving the real statistical realities of the racism experienced by Black people in law enforcement, given the sort of inability to make broader change from within that institution, perhaps there's many other ways to do work in this world that could lead to a more liberatory workspace, for example. Yeah. Kind of like a librarian, perhaps.
Right. Okay. Next question. What are your thoughts on equity, diversity, and inclusion training as it pertains to anti-racism? Do you find it effective?
I think that equity, diversity, and inclusion is not what is going to bring about the kinds of human liberatory and emancipatory projects that we need. Right? So I do think that, of course, in a workplace, for people to have some kind of training around the existence of race, around pluralism, like these are things I think that education is generally good, right? But I think that to answer the question of, will this address the issue of systemic and structural racism? Not necessarily, unless it's accompanied by other more structural changes, right? So you can have all the EDI trainings in the world, but if you're not hiring and retaining Black people in a workplace, then those trainings are only doing so much, right? So I think that it's just important to not think about them as replacements for structural racism, but thinking about, learning can be good for its own sake, and that we need to see sort of more transformative shifts as well that are going to address meaningful kinds of racial and gendered exclusions.
Okay. Our next question. Hi, Robyn. Thank you for your invaluable work. Can you elaborate on how you may see a care-based system implemented in schools in lieu of punishments, suspensions, and expulsions?
Absolutely. So I think that I've actually learned so much from Nauda Robinson and Leroy Newbold, who are co-directors of the Toronto Freedom School, of which Nauda is actually the Transformative Justice lead. And so much of what they've actually been doing is developing an approach to do transformative justice with young people that avoids and helps manage problems and manage conflict and manage harms in ways that, again, are not punitive, are not suspension or expulsion based. So I think that if we look towards sort of like liberatory ways of childhood education, we'll see that, again, a lot of these models are sort of pre-existing, in the ground, but are very rarely implemented from an institutional way. So at this point now in Ontario, you have some kind of possibility for restorative justice being forwarded. But this push for transformative justice, I think, is something that's happening from a lot of the front lines of Black liberatory educators. And I think is something that can teach us all about how else we can manage conflict, especially when it comes to young people, and helping them to thrive.
Okay. All right. Now, our next question is really about maybe shifting away from policing and looking at the university and post-secondary education in Canada. In the last few years, we've seen, or rather in the last year, we've seen commitments from universities, concrete commitments. I think some universities have committed to cluster hires. Just last week, over 40 universities in Canada signed the National Charter on Anti-Black Racism. I'm wondering whether, of course, this has not come in a vacuum. This has all come mostly from organizing by, students past and present, students, faculty, staff at these universities. I'm wondering what you think about, these efforts, whether, what can be done to sustain them, and maybe what can be done to hold universities accountable.
First, I just do want to celebrate that after decades of exhausting and, often fruitless organizing on behalf of Black students and communities, that these changes are finally sort of beginning to be made. I think that really there are generations of Black students who were bringing issues, who continue to forward this issue over and over again, only to have it sort of erased and negated by the time they graduated and went back. So I just want to sort of celebrate with you, as you'd highlighted, that these commitments come as a result of long-standing organized resistance with traditions that are continually erased, dating back to Black students rejecting racism in institutions of higher education, like for the so-called Sir George Williams affair, right? Being one primary example of how long the struggle has been going on. And of course, we know that was not probably the first racist incident that Black students had to manage. So I think that, of course, it's crucial that Black people are hired as faculty. I think we can look to, something that I realized even writing Policing Black Lives was the incredible richness and archive of Black life across this country that exists in master's theses and dissertations that, of course, never became books, because if you don't hire anyone that goes through these programs, then again, you're just contributing to the erasure and really an epistemic violence against Black political thought in this country. So I think that, of course, these hires are crucial, but they're also really just the tip of the iceberg that has been the long-standing erasure of Black thinkers, of Black political thought, in this country. So I think that it's really important that this is happening. It's absolutely important to celebrate the kinds of wins that came from the result of sustained struggle, and I also just really want to lift up the really valuable work that was done, for example, by Afua Cooper and Andrea Davis to actually create Black Studies minors, for example, right? Because Black hires are one thing, but focused Black hires around the study of Black life is something that is, even more, I think, really valuable to point towards and celebrate as a crucial win on behalf of really a constellation of Black communities. So I think it's important to remember that Black hires don't mean Black studies, and that is another nexus of this struggle as universities are beginning to change that is important, right? That hiring Black people doesn't necessarily mean actually valuing the study of Black life, the value of Black political thought more broadly, that these things are not necessarily interchangeable, and that it's actually important to push for the creation of Black studies. And remembering, of course, that even Black studies itself is not just a wholly determined one thing, but it's an ongoing site of struggle. Which Black studies, which kinds of Black studies, right? So if we look to, for example, the institutionalization of Black studies in the United States after massive student protests, for example, in the 1960s, we see that, of course, there's been an ongoing push, which writers like Roderick Ferguson have highlighted, looking at the ways that universities have tried to sort of incorporate, Black studies and other and queer studies in many other movements to sort of co-opt, right? So to say that this is something, the hiring of Black people across the country in these universities is long overdue, and an ongoing struggle to actually value Black epistemologies and Black thought and the study of Black life is not yet the place that we are at. And even then, it's important to remember that it's not the same thing as Black liberation, even with critical Black faculty. So I guess just to remind us to celebrate our wins as they come, and also remember that the struggle is long, and that these will likely be contested sites for a long time, right?
Right, I think we've got time for maybe two more questions. One here says, I'm a student in a social work program. I'd like your thoughts on the way social work acts as an agent of state. We learn about systems of oppression, but the profession is oppressive itself. I'm wondering if you can, sorry, the question was a little bit wonky, but I'm wondering if you can get the full picture and speak to it.
Sure. I mean, I think that comment, I think it's a clearly articulated comment, right? That's highlighting sort of the ways in which social work has been thought about as benevolent. And A.J. Withers has just published a great book about this, actually, about the sort of benevolent, the quote unquote benevolent histories of social work, and the ways that it has for a long time been a racializing project and a project of surveillance of poor peoples, of working class communities, of Black and Indigenous communities, right? So it's important to reckon with those histories and not always allow ourselves for things that are called, quote unquote, the caring professions, the benevolent oppressions, to let institutions off the hook for harms that they've enacted, right? So I think that that's really crucial in terms of the ongoing removal of Black and Indigenous kids from their homes and placement in foster care. We need to think about the role of social workers as well, and in the punitive practices that are enacted against, for example, Black moms and Indigenous parents. And remember, and just to remember that those histories are not past, that those histories are present, and to structure the way that we think about justice accordingly, right?
Okay. So, can you speak more about the role of solidarity when it comes to radical change plus organizing? With the burnout that comes with organizing, how can meaningful synergies be built long-term among communities?
Yeah, I think that's kind of always the question of the times, right? I think that there's ways in which some people go on to start organizing young and organize for their entire lives. There are other organic movements that erupt, as the result of something that people can plug into briefly and as a flash, but that can also be really effective and innovative. And that there are some kinds of struggles and campaigns. If we think about the long-standing struggle of what it's taken to elaborate, for example, sanctuary city movements in cities across the United States and Canada that do require long engagements over long periods of time. So I think that I think that there's just a certain way that we have to think about what it means to make these kinds of commitments to movement, but also realizing that some people will pop in and out depending on categories of their life, and deciding that that's okay too, right? So just trying to find out the different ways of bringing people in, whether that's for one big event or whether that's to commit to sort of long-term strategy. And really, it's effective organizers that are able to differentiate those two things and do that, right? And that's a particular skill, and it's a skill that's undervalued. There's a lot of credit, for example, that goes to people who are able to write about injustice, and Andrea Ritchie writes about this often, but many academics, even really radical, wonderful ones, are really in effect movement stenographers. And what we actually have is the stenography of this brilliant organizing strategies that are often happening on the ground, right? And that's a labor that we actually need to pay more attention to, despite it not being sort of formally professionalized as a place of knowledge production. So I guess what I'm trying to highlight is that that's a very particular skill of knowing how and when to bring in the vast amounts of people that it's going to take, of course, if we're going to try to see the kind of transformative change that we will need to create more livable futures in this time.
Okay, well, thank you so much for engaging with these questions, Robyn. I have in mind to ask you one more, but I think I'm going to stop here.